Good evening and welcome to Occidental College's 2022 Stafford Ellison Wright Scholar in Residence Conversation, New Approaches to Caribbean History and Heritage. Good evening and welcome. My name is Regina Freer. I'm a professor here at Occidental. I'm a faculty member in the politics department, and I also teach in our newest department, the Department of Black Studies. We're going to start today's program in a minute with an introduction of our guests, Professor Justin Dunnavant and Dr. Chinzira Davis-Kahina. Their conversation will run about 45 minutes. Following that, we will moderate, or they will moderate, a Q&A portion of the event. Questions should be put into the Q&A, which is at the bottom of your screen. You can add those at any point, and when they turn to question and answer, they will respond to as many as they can. Please share your name and include your affiliation to the college as you ask a question, whether you're a current student, alum, a parent, faculty, staff, or a friend. We'll have about a total of 90 minutes for today's full session, and we will do our best to get as many questions in as possible. There are a number of people to thank. There's no way an event like this could go on without folks working hard to make it so. And so I want to give a special thanks to Lynn Vo, who is helping us, has helped us with the tech today. Romy Corona, Valeria Mena, Allie Gordon, and Dana Brantley have all helped behind the scenes to make sure this happens. They provided so much expertise and time, and so I really want to thank them for that. I also want to thank the Black Alumni Association. I'll say a bit more about them in a minute, and the Stafford Ellison Wright Committee in the Black Studies Department, particularly Michael Amoroso and Erica Ball, who also worked really hard to bring this to fruition. So we gather tonight to honor ancestors, the Tongva peoples on whose unceded territory Occidental sits, and the first Black graduates of Occidental College. In 1987, the Black alumni of Occidental College endowed a fund in the name of those first Black graduates, Dr. Janet Stafford, George F. Ellison, and Barbara Bowman Wright, all of the class of 1952. This is a special anniversary of their graduation, the 70th. So please join me in saying Ashe for all of these ancestors. Today's webinar is made possible by an endowed fund created by the Black alumni to celebrate the 70th anniversary of this graduation of these three. And so in their honor, the Black Alumni Organization created the BAO Student Champion Award. This Champion Award recognizes a current or former Oxy faculty or staff member who's had a significant impact on Black student success. And this year, the BAO will honor one Black student champion for each decade since 1952. If you want to know more about the award or to possibly nominate someone, links will be available later in the chat, so please pay attention to that. Every year, we invite an outstanding scholar to join us in residency, celebrating Black excellence, spending time with our students, delivering a public lecture, and participating in a public conversation about their work. Since 2012, an incredible list of scholars have joined us. Daniel Widener, Alondra Nelson, Dorothy Roberts, Kathy Cohen, Kianga Yamada-Taylor, Chanda Prescott-Weinstein, C. Riley Snorton, and last year, Keisha Blaine. They're all cutting-edge thinkers, researchers, and writers. This year, we are so fortunate to add Justin Dunnavant to this list. For those who were able to join us for Professor Dunnavant's lecture last evening, you've been introduced to his brilliance. For those joining us for the first time, you're really in for a treat. Dr. Justin Dunnavant is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at UCLA. He holds a bachelor's in history and anthropology from Howard University and an MA and PhD from the University of Florida. His work has taken him all over the African diaspora to Ethiopia, Belize, Jamaica, Tanzania, Mozambique, and the Gambia. We learned last night about some of his innovative and current work in the US Virgin Islands. This work investigates the relationship between ecology and enslavement in the former Dutch West Indies. Danish West Indies, excuse me. His numerous publications have appeared in sources like the Journal of Archaeological Sciences, Nature, and Antipode, a radical journal of geography, and many, many more. An AAUS scientific scuba diver, Professor Dunnavant works with the organization Diving with a Purpose in their maritime archaeological training program. This organization has a special focus on the protection, documentation, and interpretation of shipwrecks from the African slave trade. In addition to his archaeological research, Dr. Dunnavant is a co-founder of the Society of Black Archaeologists, has worked with the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, is recognized by National Geographic as an emerging explorer, and you can even watch him on Hulu in the series Your Attention Please. I'm not sure that he sleeps, but we definitely know that he is very deep. When we asked Professor Dunnavant who he thought might be a good conversationalist, he immediately responded, Dr. Chen, his partner in this work since 2016. Dr. Chinzera Davis Kahina, respectfully known as Dr. Chen, is a media technologist, cultural ethnographer, an educator, artist, a naturopathic therapist, an ordained priestess, and an author. I wonder if she sleeps either. She is a founding director and faculty of the Virgin Islands and Caribbean Cultural Center in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Virgin Islands, the only historically Black college and university in the Caribbean and a land-grant institution. Dr. Davis Kahina is co-founder of the PerAnc House of Life, an international NGO and spiritual institution promoting culture, healing arts, technology, and spirituality, inspiration, freedom, and education. She's a prolific author, researcher, and editor. Her publications include Our Visions, Our Way, Community Transformations in St. Croix and the Virgin Islands, published in the National Trust Forum Journal. Indigenous Native Africans and Amerindians, Culture, Heritage, and Identity in the Virgin Islands and Caribbean Americas and Bonaire. And Heritage, Education, and Ancestral Legacy, Freedom Fighters and Maroons of the Caribbean Americas. She's also created an ethno-documentary film called Queens of the Virgins, produced by PerAnc New Media in 2017. Dr. Davis Kahina is Vice President of the Caribbean Studies Association, an Executive Council representative of the Caribbean Pan-African Network in alliance with CARICOM and the African Union. Her research and humanitarian work continues to proactively honor and respect the legacies of African Amerindians, Indigenous and Maroon peoples and nations globally. Please join me in welcoming this amazing duo for what promises to be a thought-provoking conversation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Freer, for that amazing introduction. And thank you everyone at Occidental College for inviting us. And perhaps most importantly, thank you, Dr. Chen, for joining me here today in this virtual space. I'm sorry we couldn't be in person, but we'll make sure to bring the VI as well as our different cultural backgrounds to bear in this virtual space. And hopefully honor those that come before us and honor those beautiful ones not yet born. And I give thanks for everything that led us to come together and allow this moment to come into place. And I just want to preface it by saying, when I had this opportunity to bring somebody in conversation with me about the work that I do, I immediately wanted to flip it and said, I want to use this as an opportunity to interview and be in conversation with Dr. Chen. So I'm thankful that you're allowed to be here. For those of you in the audience, please feel free to drop questions in the Q&A as they arise. I have not primed Dr. Chen with the questions I'm going to ask. So you will get real answers, and we'll be riffing off each other and using this as an opportunity to really have an intergenerational conversation about Africana studies, Caribbean studies, and more importantly, where it is that we've come from and where it is that we're going collectively. And I would like to say that through my work and through our work together, Dr. Chen has not only become a peer and a collaborator, but my literal godmother. And for that, I'm honored and blessed, and I appreciative. So Dr. Chen, thank you so much for being here.
It's an honor and a privilege. First and foremost, I really want to thank everyone at Occidental College for making this opportunity available, not only during Black History Month, because we know that's all the time. However, adding to this type of a discourse around the origin, some of the key objectives around Africana studies and its linkage and connection to Caribbean studies, which is still expanding, still evolving, still transforming, and to have the opportunity and the honor and privilege to have this discussion with Dr. Justin Dunnavant, who's like our, we have pom-poms and cheerleaders behind him all the time. It's always an honor and a privilege from the very first time that he came into the Virgin Islands of the US to really embrace the people, the culture, the heritage, and to bring his skills, talents, and expertise on all levels. So for that, we're very grateful as well.
Thank you, Dr. Chen. I wanted to really start this conversation with grounding it in Africana studies and Black studies as you came to know it when you were coming up sort of through the ranks. And I'm not going to say how long ago that was, but I know that.
Just the other day.
Just the other day. There you go. I know that at that time, there was a different social context in which you were emerging. The intellectual trajectories, the people who you interacted with really shaped not only what it is that you would study, but what it is that would become now known as Black Studies and Africana Studies. And I know you've bounced around to many different institutions. You had a stint here in California with your PhD at UC San Diego. And I just wanted to know if you could touch a bit on your intellectual sort of maturation, and then tell us a bit about your time as well in West Africa and in Burkina Faso, if you could.
Okay, that's a good question because you took me into 3 places. So I'll start as to the core as much as possible. I was really influenced strongly by the work of Dr. Yosef Ben Yakanan, as well as Dr. John Henrik Clarke and others. I focus on those 2 in particularly because there were these opportunities, even from high school coming into my undergraduate work at Rutgers University in New Jersey, to have an opportunity to hear these great minds speak of the foundation, the cornerstone of Black studies, African studies, Afro-American studies. It kept morphing into other things, growing into that Africana studies space. There were persons that influenced a lot of my work, Barbara Ann Teer, while it was through the arts and that whole Negro ensemble company that became more of a Black ensemble company. Those were the persons that influenced a lot of my understanding around African Black studies, growing into Africana studies. My professor at Rutgers, and again, it's is Professor Avery Brooks. And, most people remember him more in the artistic theatrical space. However, the core of his content was to guide us to do the research and the study of these great minds that were the formulators of Black studies at that particular time. There were persons that also shifted that whole context because they were reminding us, well, then we have to go back and look at the great minds like Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois, like C.L.R. James in this Caribbean context, forgetting that all of these persons were contributors to this whole paradigm, which shifted how persons were focusing on key objectives around Black studies of undoing the white racism piece and placing our history, our legacy, our civilization building to another higher plane that was inclusive. We didn't use diversity, equity, and inclusion then. It was more of, we have to tell our story, we have to give our narrative and do it with the same intellectual integrity and excellence like anyone else. So there were a number of Chancellor Williams' work became a core piece around understanding these studies programs. And there are a host of professors, a host of scholars of note. There are many names that come into this whole list that I may not always include here during this discussion, but there are many that influenced that particular work. And it began to shift how I began to look at how I was going to study, to become an educator, to engage in this type of research, and to be able to pinpoint some critical ways of looking at the intellectual space when it comes to Africana, Black, Afro-American, Negro studies. There were a number of associations and scholars linked to those associations that influenced how we began to look at this whole field and course and take it seriously, not to say, oh, well, this professor is going to be easy and we're all Black and we're going to come in a room and Black power and we're good. It was more, the real power was that we were going to come to these spaces and contribute academic excellence at the highest place. Like that's, at least in my journey, I feel that some people may not have caught that and thought they were easier courses. But when I studied under the tutelage of Dr. Ivan Van Certima, he was rough. It was not my easiest class at all. I'm saying that because, there was some powerful work that he was already engaged in, and he pulled some of us even to the same Virgin Islands, particularly around his work that he was doing in Hull Bay, in St. Thomas, as well as in St. John, not only here in St. Croix. This could go on.
Yeah, no, that's important. I think it's critical to show, especially the multidimensionality of many of these early figures, because we often fall into this trap of knowing these scholars by the book they published or by the one major thing that they did. I didn't even know Van Certima's influence in St. Thomas as a thing. And there's the different elements to these things that I think begin to come out, and the ways in which we as younger scholars need to look back at that, but also to think about how we can push some of their later projects forward into spaces we didn't even know were possible. So I'm appreciative of that. Yeah, I did want to ask though, and dig a little bit deeper in terms of what eventually led you to Burkina Faso, if you're able and interested to, to talk about that.
And I'm honored to talk about that because I was in grad school. At that time, I was at Pepperdine, and I was really influenced by the Pan-African movement because that was, Black studies always was geared towards liberation. It was always geared towards decolonization. We may not have always used that term decolonization and self-determination and so forth, but the focus was the power, the restoration of power amongst African people that had to come through education. It had to come through economics. It had to come through a different approach to literacy. And most importantly, for us to undo the damages that were done by the institutionalized forms of chattel enslavement. And even before the chattel enslavement, the disconnect to our ancestral African memory, right? And that led to, opportunities to go to the African continent, because that was the other part of the Black studies piece. It wasn't just to study who made the traffic light, who was the first PhD in, in predominantly white institutions or even HBCUs. It was to be able to be proactive with this information that we gather. We know how great the work is of Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, but how do you make that proactive? How do you bring it forward? And the intentionality was to bring it inside of the US for those that were in the 48 contiguous and or Canada. And for those of us that were coming out of Caribbean spaces, my roots are in the Caribbean, Dominican Republic in particular, and as well as St. Martin. And my family always said, I don't need you to just study this thing and talk and write. I need you to study this, talk, write, and change the actual space that you live in. Make it better than how you met it. And that led to going into different parts of Africa. I've had the honor and privilege at that particular time of being in like about 8 to 10 countries. And we had an invitation for graduate students to come and contribute to this relatively new independent country that used to be Upper Volta and became Burkina Faso under the leadership of the Honorable Thomas Sankara. And working with a president took my academic research publication energy to a different space because it became purposeful. It wasn't like I was only doing it for a grade or for me to be able to say I had something peer reviewed, which is important. It's just that it allowed for us to have a more pragmatic approach. So again, Black studies, Africana studies, Caribbean studies fused around that time. And we're talking like the early 80s. And it shifted significantly, at least in my life and amongst many of the scholars that were around me. So, some persons chose to repatriate. Some persons chose to complete their studies in the West and then return and help build institutions inside of different parts of the African continent or even other parts of the world and come and bring that kind of intellectual strength inside of their living spaces. I learned so much in that time. And over the course of that particular invitation, we were there off and on about 2 years. And I learned so much about the pragmatic element of Black studies, Africana studies, Caribbean studies. And there was a rich exchange amongst the scholars and the students and just the persons at the marketplace in Burkina Faso, from Ouagadougou to Boba Dioulasso, which is like from the capital area, more central, to the areas that are more south going towards neighboring Ghana. And it allowed for another layer of Black studies to come forth. So we were dealing not only with social sciences or humanities, we were dealing with all aspects of economic engagement and development. I learned a lot about plumbing and electrical work. I learned about health and the inequities that exist. I learned a lot about gender studies, and we didn't call it gender studies because I watched a head of state transform, like in less than a year, how women were integral to the leadership roles. That was like his main thing, was that the country can only be but so strong if women are not in positions of power and authority and fully integrated in this. I hadn't seen that in the West. So it shifted how I engaged in, it just shifted significantly how I looked at Africana studies completely. Not that I wasn't into, the movement and all of those other areas. However, it gave a pragmatic form of engagement so that I didn't just study it for a grade. We went there and they told you, you're here to help us build. You're here to help us grow and to take our story in its most accurate form back to where you come from and then come again. But it was not just that we came and we researched and extrapolated information, went and published it and never came back and helped the people. Is that making sense?
100%, 100%. I got so many things tracking in my mind right now. And I think, that's a critical element, I think, of Black studies that we don't fully talk about, is that level of pragmatism that you discussed that was literally embedded into your educational system back then because of the immediacy of the need of the pragmatism and of you all doing the work that you do. Sometimes I tend to have frustrations in academia in general with this idea of pragmatism not even being a topic of conversation when we talk about the work that we do. And we do fall into this trap sometimes of, what publications are we getting? What journals are they going in? How can we turn it into a book? And all of these different other metrics that have been set by these quote unquote institutions of higher education. When in reality, it's that pragmatism that is really meaningful. And I'm reminded of when I went to Tanzania and had a chance to meet Pete and Charlotte O'Neill. And actually, Baba Geronimo Pratt was out there at that same time.
Oh my goodness, around the greats.
Yes, yes. And that was a powerful moment because you're literally talking to Black Panthers who are telling you what we are doing here in Tanzania is a literal progression of what we were building on the streets in Oakland and Kansas City and LA. And to see that translation occur in another context, and to see Pan-Africanism in action, to see Black studies in action, to see Africana studies in action, was really powerful. And it reminded me of this, again, this context that these are conversations, both intellectual and practical, that happen on the grassroots level. And it reminds me of a mantra that Mr. Ken Stewart always puts forward from Diving with a Purpose, was that, we're just ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And I think that's a powerful note to keep with us as we continue to do this work moving forward. So I appreciate you for adding that.
I'm still stuck at your experience in Tanzania. That's an ongoing piece. And as of late, to see elders like Mama Charlotte still doing this work, and arts and spirituality to embrace another layer of, again, intellectual excellence.
100%.
And still doing it as an elders to this day. That's powerful. And I honor her. I honor Baba P, because that's something that's not always encouraged in our institutional spaces amongst intellectuals and academics. And not to say that, as I've said earlier, the peer-reviewed portion, the publications, the books, the articles, those are significant, and that's part of that, part and parcel of what is to be done. However, education, and now this is where I put my educational technology and my educational administrator hat on, it's shifted in the 21st century. And the progression, as you were asking, how did I come into this? What were some of the areas that allowed for me to still remain within this space of what was Negro studies, what was Black studies, Afro-American, African-American, Africana, and all these other fusions. Like now it's more like Africana, Latin American, Caribbean. I mean, we've got a whole, some people just call it global, and some want to add indigenous. And the essence of that natural, native, indigenous, ancestral African space. And when people hear what I'm saying, they're hearing Nia. It's very purposeful, and it's very intentional how we begin to look at the transformations from, again, as persons were hearing me, Du Bois opened up a very serious space of looking at Negro studies, the affairs of colored people, quote unquote, very early. The influence of the work of CLR James inside of these Caribbean spaces did another layer of contribution towards Africana, Caribbean, global studies. We would be remiss if we did not include the work of Toni Martin in a more contemporary space, or to even look at Dr. Chancellor Williams in terms of what the chronology of what took place manifested, or Dr. Eric Williams coming out of Trinidad and Tobago, and the focus on the economic history and the drivers around those things that influenced, quote unquote, Black studies, Africana studies, Caribbean studies, et cetera. And there's like a host of programs that have been established throughout, various institutions, and most of them are grounded in communitarian work. You just mentioned, the Black Panther Party, those, Dr. Huey Newton, I'm just saying,
right.
and he just had a solar return in a heavenly space. People forget that it wasn't just activism without intellectual grounding in a lot of that activism. And that's something that persons forget. There were a lot of discussions. Persons had work study circles that were grounded not, within organizations like the All African People Revolutionary Party and others, and people were actively studying and researching. It wasn't that people just wanted to be in the movement or just go to a march. Persons actually engaged in focused it wasn't just a book club reading novels. Persons were studying the work of Diop, looking at Jacob Carruthers' work, looking at Dr. Ben's work, looking at John Henrik Clarke's work, looking at Marimba Ani and her previous space, even before Urugu, right? The persons, looking, and again, from an anthropological, sociological framing, they were looking at Dr. Frances Cress Welsing's work. There were a lot of persons that, the Afrocentricity piece through Dr. Molefi Asante. I mean, there are a number, and through the spaces that came through a more Kemetic Nile Valley space, there were a lot of researchers that have come, Dr. Mario Bizzi, in a more contemporary space. There's like a large number of works, that have to be included. The work of Dr. Ntedi Nelson. I mean, there's so many. It's very rich. It's because all of these persons either were in academic spaces, doing work. I'll use a contemporary scholar. I refer to her as an eldris, and Dr. Carol Davies Boyce Davies, forgive me, Carol Boyce Davies, and again, has done work at Cornell that's insurmountable around these themes that are linked to not only the space and places of women and gender in Black studies, in Africana studies, and there's many more. This is something that gets left behind primarily because a lot of the youth in contemporary times, it's just to take the class.
Right.
It's not to show the connection between the class, your community, your family, your village, your life, right? We're very fortunate to have leaders of note, like Dr. Vereen Shepherd at University of the West Indies, Mona, to take this whole discussion around reparations to another space where there's an actual reparations institute that embraces Africana, Black, Caribbean studies, gender studies. So it's interdisciplinary and it's taking it to another place. And various Caribbean studies graduate programs that exist again at UWI in the Cave Hill, Barbados campus, that some were formulated through the work of Dr. Marcia Burroughs. Persons may not know of these significant scholars that have contributed, Dr. Rupert Lewis. I mean, there's so many, Attorney David Commerciang, of course, Dr. Beckles, Sir Hilary Beckles, who is the vice chancellor at UWI, and is able to use that, his expertise around economic history, to then shift the trajectory of even how we look at Caribbean studies, whether it's through a cultural lens, a scientific lens, an environmental climate change lens, a literary lens, an artistic lens. I mean, there's so many different places. So when we say Black studies, some persons tend to marginalize it.
Right.
When we say studies the same way, yes.
Yeah, when I hear that, I often hear these arguments about how Black studies isn't departmentalized. And I always are like, do you realize how much of Black studies we still don't study in the institution? It's like people will study Africana studies and we'll get the same 3 names of Du Bois and so forth, but don't even realize there are entire intellectual genealogies from Rex Nettleford and a number of other scholars that don't even get mentioned in a lot of these discussions unless you're in that specific space.
Right.
And I think it's critical that we, again, have to continue to uplift their names, realize a lot of times their publications were in what we would consider obscure journals or places, or we have to go and actually retrieve publications that are out of print to bring their words back to the public. But it's so much wider than what it is that we're even to present to individuals. And reading the backstories and all these people is critical as well. But you raised the critical point, and I think that the topic around institution building. And I know, we co-founded the Society of Black Archaeologists, myself and Dr. Ayanna Llewellyn, and give thanks. And we've been moving in a space really building off of the work that you all have laid and literally studying other Black institutions. I have my students read about the Institute of the Black World, for example, and the power that was created in that organization, the ways in which it built off of Du Bois's Atlanta conventions, and the ways it can continue to move forward. And I'm wondering, just from your perspective, what are some of the institutions you've been involved in building, and sort of what was the direction or intention behind those those institutions as well?
One of the institutions that helped to guide and craft a lot of my work, and I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge Dr. Mfundishi Juhudimes Hassan El Salim.
Okay.
I knew him just as Brother Hassan back in the day.
Right.
But you know, when you speak of Dr. Mfundishi, he incorporated the language around, you know, these independent Black schools that surfaced all around the 48 contiguous, you know, the Nyeri Institute, and named after the Honorable Dr. Julius Nyeri, around that theme of educators learning in Tanzania and bringing those teachings into a US space and keep African-centered instruction on point and in place. That was one of my early influences, and working around these institutes of Black education that were, you know, Dr. Bobby Wright, persons remember him, and the work he did around, you know, various aspects of social sciences and his history and psychology in particular, that were speaking to the mindset shift that was essential for us to be able to even embrace Black studies or embrace Africana studies and not see it as minor or less important than studying English or European history, etc., or biology and so forth. There were a significant number of like Garvey institutes that were building throughout the country, as well as in Canada, throughout the Caribbean. There were these intentional programs to help educators move in the direction of more African Black centric types of instruction. And I would be remiss if I didn't include even like the Babalosi programs to teach educators to incorporate Pan-African studies that were fostered through some of the work of sisters like attorney Tempu Nefertari and others, you know, including one of its early directors in Barbados, David Comisiang, and others. And again, coming out of an institutional space, there were a number of Black schools. Persons actually pushed that whole construct between this, from in my time, you know, from late 60s coming into the early 90s, these Black schools that shifted into Afro-American schools or African-American schools or African-centric schools or Pan-African schools, and persons actually integrated. They had curriculum, you know, books, activities, resources, packets. You had, and I would, you know, speak of many of the programs. When I was at Pepperdine, I had the opportunity to work at an independent Black school in Compton.
Oh, wow.
It was the main administrator. We always refer to her as Sister Uta, and Yolanda Reed, you know, ultimately became Dr. Yolanda Uta Reed, and she developed Children's Space. And it was an African-centric homeschool that was on campus in the ground. The children were engaged in agriculture, astronomy, all of the architectural pieces, you know, construction works, as well as all of the things that govern arts and sciences. And it was done in a way that helped to build the whole child and the family. I want to highlight that, the whole child and the family. There wasn't an argument when parents were asked to come to a parent-teachers meeting, because that was part of the intention. It's like not like what we see in some traditional public institutions where you have a PTA meeting and you have a school population of, you know, 2,000 and 10 parents come. It was a very integral type of experience. There were a number of programs that I've had a chance, again, like in Burkina Faso, even with my horrible French in that first year, we had an opportunity to work with independent institutions in the countryside that were utilizing the work of Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Theophilo Benga, and others to really help the children and their parents and the educators embrace their African centeredness and to pull out all, to extrapolate, like key points and so forth. There were things, again, that's part of how PanAfrican Institute, PanAfrican University had this legacy building piece, because the intention was to be able to incorporate culture, healing, arts, technology, and spirituality, but doing it through a lens. All of us that have been participatory, all of us are trained, all of us have gone through, the traditional academy, if you will. And at the same time, the pragmatic piece, the transcultural piece, the multilingualism, and most importantly, the respect for the restoration of our humanity. Whole plane that was central to us, pulling and gathering, from, there's so much information. Dr. David Horn's research was very instrumental while he was at, UCLA, as well as the work he did, as a now emeritus professor from Cal State Northridge. There was work from so many scholars that Dr. Riketi Amen was able to give us the content of understanding these ancient languages and bring them into contemporary times meaningfully to help build other Black Africana cultural studies type programs that have influenced, the world. And I'm sure that with the next set of questions that you have posed, I'll be able to get these other names, because there's the list is long. The persons that were influenced by Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyden, we forget sometime, and like all of his heirs ended up with something awesome. But a special shout out to his great granddaughter, Dr. Namada Blyden, because again, these are persons that are doing the work all now and are building from over a century or 2 centuries ago. And that's something that we overlook when we're having this type of engagement around the intergenerational spaces between, what was considered Negro history and studies, and how it morphed into, I shouldn't say morphed, how it transformed and grew and evolved is a better term, into what it is now. And the fact that people have to defend it, the fact that people have to defend engaging in Africana studies and do not have to engage in a defense of other studies of whether it's Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, know where I'm going, right? The fact that we don't have to explain why those things are to be studied, and we have to now go through this exchange of what we can discuss around the African experience, what we can discuss around the Black experience. There's no explanation. That's an integral part of what we are to be discussing. So that's part of what also influenced my engagement in various institutions.
No, that's powerful. I think there is this need, and it's a long, arduous process. I know you emphasized the rigor of study that's involved in this, but there's definitely a need for us to go back and study these genealogies of Africana studies and Black studies, and recognizing the fact that, at the time that you were coming around and developing, we're talking about newly independent African countries that are getting off the ground. We're talking about a direct connection to African knowledge systems as well, and attempts to recover and restore those as well in different institutions, and then develop independent institutions that are based off of some of those same principles. And one of the frustrations I have in some cases with aspects of Black studies today is it seems very presentist, in the sense of there's this sort of immediacy where we don't really focus on what happened in the past. We don't really focus too much on what's happening in other contexts. It's very Atlantic focused, and it's very present focused. Although the beautiful thing about the way that we work is that you see one thing in public and on the surface, and there's probably a billion other things that are happening under the ground as we continue to move. So I love to see the ways in which those things go into maturation. There's a couple other topics I wanted to touch on too while we're here in this space discussing Africana and Black studies. And we can go as deep or as shallow into this as you would like. But one critical component that I think often gets left out of the work that we do is this aspect of spirituality, regardless of religion, regardless of creed. And in religion and spirituality, specifically spirituality in relationship to the research that we do and the work that we do. And I know you bless us every year with libations before we conduct excavations at these various ancestral sites. And I know in talking to our colleagues in the Indigenous Archaeology Collective, you know, we call these ancestral sites instead of ruins. We call these belongings instead of artifacts. We're trying to change the language around the work that we do in archaeology. And we're trying to have a more sort of attuned understanding of spirituality in regards to this work that we do, that we're often taught is supposed to be secular and is supposed to be objectified and not a subjective personal experience. And I wanted to know if you could touch just a little bit on the importance of spirituality in your work and the work that you do, to whatever degree you're comfortable with. I know it extends beyond in many directions. So
well, first, I really am grateful that you were able to couch the fullness of some of the importance that is grounded in Black studies, Caribbean studies, and the way in which we are to share that in its spiritual space. And it's really important because sometimes when you say spirituality, persons still keep it in religiosity, and it's very different.
Mm-hmm.
And part of what has been really important for us, and when I speak in the plural, because a lot of what I'm doing is because of ancestral guidance and guidance that I've prayed on, meditated on. So it's with sacred intent. The thrust is so that even when I'm speaking or I'm teaching or I'm in a community that may not be the community that I have my origins, and it's very important that I show that respect. Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why we have been involved in these types of discourses are because sometimes people come in the name of research and publication and documentation, and they just extrapolate things from these spaces without recognizing, even down to the bones and the dirt where you go, there has to be a reverence and a respect for what you have gathered, why you're even there, and to acknowledge the ancestral presence of those persons that you were studying, researching, and engaging with. It's not just to do an oral interview with your grandmother and then have it published on YouTube for a grade. It is to show that reverence and respect to the grandmother or grandfather, and to give, say it positively, as positive as possible, show that respect. Because sometimes we forget about respect and honor and integrity when we're engaged in this process, because some elements of the more Eurocentric aspects of academia do not have reverence for anything African, anything ancestral, much less spiritual. And that's something that we had to uncover and revisit, even in these Black study, Africana study spaces, is that it's very important to restore that spiritual grounding and to give honor to the ancestors who we're drawing this information from, who we're asking for guidance to even do the proper cultural heritage interpretations and to properly document. There's some things that don't need to be published. There's some things that aren't supposed to be said. And we need to recognize that and be able to tell the difference. And there's a way to tell without disrespecting ancestral memory and ancestral legacy, right? And so that's something that inside of my own work, that's part of the shift that sometimes is not well received inside of institutional spaces. And when we bring our African centeredness to a place that's uncomfortable to some, it can be, the resistance is challenging. So the intention is to restore that balance, because when we restore that balance, then we can engage in these concepts on racial equity and social justice and decolonization and reparatory justice and reparation and undoing racism, and recognizing that it's not anything supreme in the dismantling of humanity. So I tend not to use that term white supremacy. I've always been taught to shift because it's terrorism, and we need to acknowledge what it really is. When you come and uncover spaces to do your archaeological research, your whole team, you must prepare them already, because Dr. Dunnavant, you have been able to have them know, before we move one piece of dirt, we're going to honor the space so that whatever we find, if it's, a button, Chinese or even bone, that we're respecting the space. Some persons have not done that. I'll give an example. When you heard me speak about Dr. Ivan Van Certima's work, which at that particular time, it was around a find of 11th to 12th century Negroid skulls in Hull Bay. And institutions that were connected to that find, they were looking for Native Amerindian indigenous material. And when they found that, they left the grounds so that it would completely contaminate and they couldn't use those belongings. Right. And that was in the 70s. It's documented in his work. You can look in his work, you can look at some of his articles, and you can even look at his work, and they came before Columbus and see. And, and that was something that he came and shared with students. So there was this interest to return, those of us that were from the Caribbean, to return and contribute, and to give the proper narrative, and to bring our skills to support the uncovering and the legacy building of more truthful narratives, right? Because that's how severe it was. It was like, how can you dare say we were looking for some Taino? What do you mean, Black people?
Right. It's unconscionable to
just leave that there. We're not going to even attach that. And so that, and again, there's finds, there's so much information, to this day, we still have belongings that have been in storage, enduring hurricane after hurricane and flood after flood and fire. And that's something that, well, I'm not giving you more work, but I'm just saying.
Yeah, we're working on it. That's why we're training our replacements.
Exactly.
No, that's a powerful point. And I know there's some questions coming up in the Q&A. One particularly about the Afro-Caribbean story and how it might be applied to larger conversations around African experiences in the United States and the United Kingdom. And that got me thinking about this next project that I'm embarking on, and that you are also helping to push forward, and hopefully we can extend back into public memory. And it's this question of the UNIA, of Marcus Garvey, and of the Black Star Line. And I know we have conversations of heading to Cuba, hopefully this summer, to help push that forward. But I'm wondering too, I was talking in a class earlier today about this mantra of remember, remind, and restore that I use to live by. And I developed it just thinking through the concept of archaeology, but then also everybody kept saying I'm an old soul, even though I'm young. And I don't think they realize the degree to which I actually think of that, in the sense of, no, like, we are human beings on this earth. We have literally hundreds of thousands of years that we have forgotten. And so part of our work as archaeologists is to try to remember what it is that we forgot, to remind ourselves of those things that are valuable, and then to restore those practices so that we can continue to live for another few 100,000 years in a way that's good and right, with the world and with ecology and with our ancestors. And so all of that got me thinking about this need, again, to try to bring these things back into public memory and what it could do. And I know you've been involved in the UNIA and the various institutions as well during your time. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about your work in the organization, if you're interested, and then also about this possibility of locating the Black.
I'm always excited to share that part, because again, in academic spaces, not everybody's comfortable knowing that revolutionaries stay in academic spaces. Many persons think that they doesn't work together, and that you have to sanitize and outright obliterate your engagements in revolutionary organizations. I have had the honor of working in the Universal Negro Improvement Association, African Communities League, UNIACL, and particularly in the Rehabilitating Committee for 2020. So we'd say just UNIA, ACLRC 2020. And I've had, under the leadership of the current President General, Baba Akili Nkrumah. And I wanted to take a second because the work that we do in this organization, and persons kind of, oh no, it's one God, one aim, one destiny. Oh no, they're only dealing with Black people. And that's not a bad thing. It's a reality thing. It's so that we can strengthen the African fundamentalism, the African spaces in the world. If persons are not familiar with the work and the publications of the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garvey, I encourage them to look for any of them. And you could start with the philosophy and opinions of Marcus Garvey, so you can hear from what he wrote. Let me be clear, what he said, that his honorable wife, Amy Jacks Garvey, I want people to understand the balance, actually edited and made sure was put in print. There's Garvey's papers are quite extensive, and several institutions have had access to them, inclusive of the University of California, LA, under the leadership and research of Dr. Hill, Robert Hill. And I think it's important that persons know that when you are engaging in organizational framings, and I've had, with the appointment by PG Nkrumah as a High Commissioner General, specifically for the Caribbean Americas, right? Because there are other Commissioner Generals that engage in the African continent, those that are in Europe, those that are in the Pacific Islands, those that are in other parts, in the US, of course. And there's always been this thrust to look at the work of Garvey in his time, like looking at in the context of what transpired between the early 1900s, coming out of humble beginnings in Jamaica, and then getting into the UK, being in America, and even the whole movement now, you speaking of, In Search, I love it, In Search of the Black Star Liner. And then that whole piece around the Black Star Liner led to, because it was no internet, maybe some telegrams and some fax, over 10 million Negroes in that time gathering and galvanizing as a unified force. Not to say it was perfect, but it was a unified force parallel to the lynchings, the Jim Crow. I'm just saying, these are things that people overlook. That's what was needed at that time. And in these times, it's the resurgence and the upliftment. So again, through the lens of your research and work, through the lens of these organizational engagements, we are always pushing for the exoneration of Garvey. As recent as this week, I just mentioned the University of the West Indies, and with the leadership of Vice Chancellor Sir Hilary Beckles, along with Professor Vereen Shepherd, there was a powerful, Dr. P.G. Patterson, there was a powerful lecture, a powerful presentation around the wrongful charges. There was, and the fact that this exoneration is to completely clear all of this negativity to the name of Garvey, because it became negative to Marcus Garvey, negative to his first wife, Amy Ashwood Garvey, negative to his second wife and, mother of his two sons, Amy Jacks Garvey. It affected his son, Dr. Marcus Garvey Jr., may he rest in peace. And it still affects his surviving son and family under, his second son, Dr. Julius Garvey, MD. I want to highlight that. So it's important that persons know that when we're having these discussions around, revolutionary concepts, around African fundamentalism, African sovereignty, etc., it's not a separation as much as it is a humanitarian restoration of what's happening inside of the African Black world, and how we begin to have these discussions and authentically strategize with some teeth on how we're going to be able to put this through in the institutions, so that they can move beyond their racist behavior, and they can move beyond their discriminatory and prejudicial behavior, and they can truly be the universal thinking tanks that universities are supposed. Did I say that?
It's good. It's good. It's needed.
You really got me going.
It's needed, Dr. Chen, and we appreciate the insight. And I think, that leads us to this sort of last question, and that's really sort of where it is that we would like to see, or you would like to see, the sort of future of Africana studies and Caribbean studies going. And I say that to contextualize that and to give you time to think about that answer. We have a comment in the Q&A that asks the question about what's the role of technology and the ways that technologies are changing. And I'm thinking specifically as well about communication technologies in terms of the way we move and we continue to develop the future of Africana and Caribbean studies. For me, I can say that a lot of the work that I've been doing is essentially trying to play catch up with all of these new technologies that are emerging and thinking strategically in ways that we can implement and utilize them, while also thinking strategically about the ways in which they can be utilized in some ways in harm against us if we're not careful. And that's been developed actually in conversation with some of my colleagues working in indigenous genetics, talking about the importance of data sovereignty, specifically around genetic work and research. Some of you may have seen organizations like 23andMe are collecting DNA and data and then turning around and flipping them and selling them to pharmaceutical companies. I've been talking with my colleagues that are saying there's a great fear in genetic research done around indigenous ancestral remains, because if it's done through the National Science Foundation or other federal funding, it could be subjected to Freedom of Information Act, which means that companies could then get access to databases of genetic data, and then it can be used in very interesting ways. So those are some of the things we have to think about, as well as technologies of surveillance and how they're used. At the same time, those same technologies can also be used in life-saving ways as well if we continue to use them appropriately and correctly. And I know that as the world continues to grow, it also continues to get smaller. And our communication networks increase, our organizing networks increase. We're able to be on Zoom in many different spaces and build these out. So I'm wondering sort of, again, what it is that you see as the future direction of this conversation around Africana studies and Caribbean studies, and what some of the key issues may be in the immediate future as well.
That it's really important that we can move beyond having to apologize and over-defend for the need of Africana studies and Caribbean studies in our institutions. And what I'm going to say is going to be probably I think it's not controversial, but to some, there's a thought process around the Caribbean, especially in the Western Hemisphere, being central to civilization development in the Americas. And almost every thread around economic development, around environmental engagement and consciousness, around healthcare, around literary fusion and flexibility, publication, copyright, intellectual thoughts that are connected to that. Everything around cultural creatives, music, the industries, the revolutionary fervor that's connected in this Caribbean space stretches through literally at the center of the Americas, and then it goes to respective poles. There are many persons that, while the same thread of Black power was happening in the 48 contiguous US, it was also happening throughout different parts of Canada, while happening in Central and South America. We overlook on what's going on like in Panama, Costa Rica, Honduras, El Salvador, Nicaragua, persons think it's just an indigenous Mayan space. And there were various movements, thrusts of activity, and Caribbean studies properly integrated within this Africana study framework would provide for a more holistic and a highly intellectual form of excellence in terms of study, framing, technology building, and more. And the importance of why people come to university, why people go into these institutions of higher education. The purpose used to be that you're going to come back and build in your respective community, village, and society. It wasn't like you just went to university and stayed on the Barbie doll pedestal. Went to this institution to learn these skills, talents, and expertise, and then bring that to build up your respective community, your respective nation, your respective society, and build stronger human civilization and beyond. And we've lost that. We, collectively speaking, not to say that there aren't scholars that are engaged in that kind of restorative work and engaging work. So I'm always, even within institutions of higher education, if you find yourself having to fight and defend for a Black studies or a Caribbean studies program, then that's really a sign that your institution is not prepared and is not ready to do the work that's required to uplift and build civilization in your respective area. That's and essentially that's something that has been for ongoing. I see her here, so I want to make sure that I give that prop. One of my colleagues, Dr. Molly Perry, who is a phenomenal social scientist in the College of Liberal Arts and Social Sciences at the University of the Virgin Islands on our St. Thomas campus. Amazing work inside of getting our undergraduate students to understand the importance of seeing social sciences and the cultural nuances through a Virgin Island space and lens, through a Caribbean lens, and then bringing that in throughout the Americas and the entire world, alongside others that are working with her. And I think that, and I'm glad that you're here, Dr. Perry, and I just think, but more importantly, the things that we were doing inside of the Virgin Islands Caribbean Cultural Center, that was part of the work, was to nurture and cultivate initiatives, programs, research, publications, technological framings, and we utilize digital media alongside, various communication programs, and people were in shock because the students that were learning media technology, the content that they were gaining these exemplary programs from were coming through a Caribbean studies, global studies, African-centered studies, indigenous studies lens. So it was interdisciplinary. In the future, it's imperative there should never, ever be an institution of higher education, definitely not one in the Caribbean, that does not have undergraduate programs in Caribbean studies and African studies, as well as master's and doctoral programs, period.
Right.
And and especially under the lens of, well, we can just do a generic interdisciplinary studies piece, and maybe if the student is interested, they could do something. No, it has to be given the same credence, the same strength, the same importance, because all of these other areas, biology, mathematics, physics, computer science, are very important. I want to make sure for my STEM colleagues, I'm not forgetting you.
Right.
Remember that STEM has moved and evolved to STEAM. And that extra A, they might not have put the letter STEAM because it wouldn't have sounded the same, but arts embraces that cultural heritage element from the gate. And it's in the future, it's really imperative, again, my humble yet direct view, that it has to be in persons, it's nothing. I think we're in good company when we say we're revolutionaries, because we get to speak of people that actually transform society in a good way.
100%. 100%. Definitely. Yeah. And I mean, just to sort of close out and wrap that up, I think too, there's this need for pragmatism to again re-inject itself in what it is that we do in the university. And again, there are persons that are moving in these directions to re-inject it and to re-engage it, but to fully understand the scope at which pragmatism was integral part of Black studies is a critical conversation and something that we need to explore further. And then if I could close out, I would close out with the words, I believe, of John Henrik Clarke, who again was a student of a student of Arturo Schomburg, who was a son of the Virgin Islands, born and raised in Borican. He was Boricua. And he said, what we know as African history and Black history are really the missing pages of world history. And I think it's critical that we continue to understand that, to uplift that, and recognize that the work we do is important, and we need many more people coming from their respective cultural backgrounds as well to do similar work in their spaces so that we can continue to uplift humanity and make this a better space for us all. So Dr. Chen, I would again love to thank you for your time with us here. I hope that we can continue to build, we can continue to have more intergenerational conversations like this as we continue to direct the next generation. And I know that they're hungry for these conversations as much as I'm hungry for these conversations, because Dr. Perry told me that there were some students from the University of the Virgin Islands huddled around their computer in their dorm room last night, listening to my talk. So I'm glad to see we had that. So thank you again. Thank you again. And I'd like to invite faculty from Occidental College to close out as well.
Thank you both. We're virtually giving a major round of applause to Dr. Dunnavant and Dr. Chen. This has been really a fruitful conversation for us. We're a new Black Studies department at Occidental, and so this really gives us a lot to chew on and a lot to think about and to place ourselves in that genealogy and that legacy. So thank you so much for that. And I want to thank all of you who've joined us this evening for the Stafford Ellison Wright Black Alumni Scholar in Residence talk and conversation. We've enjoyed having Dr. Dunnavant with us for the last 2 days. It's been virtual, but he's not that far away from us, so hopefully we'll have him physically on campus at some point soon. A big thanks also to the Black Alumni Association for your generous endowment that allows us to bring scholars like Dr. Dunnavant to campus to engage and inspire and enlighten us. Before we close, I want to give another round of thanks to the folks who helped to make this possible, Lynn Vo, Romy Corona, and others who, behind the scenes, make sure that we all look good and like this is seamless. And they've put in a lot of hard work. I also want to acknowledge our president, Harry Elam, who gave a welcome yesterday and joined us for the talk this evening as well. So we will bid everyone a good night, and thank you all for coming, and please stay tuned and stay in touch so that we can make sure that you are here for next year's. I actually just saw on Twitter that one of our former Stafford Ellison Wright Scholar in Residence has just been named to the White House Office of Science and Technology. So we have a really good track record here. So look for amazing more things to come from Professor Dunnavant. So thank you all and have a really, really good night.
Thank you.